Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 32nd Global Public Seminar in Comparative and International Education. My name is Maria Cianceliani. I'm Associate Professor of Comparative and International Education here at Oxford. We have a prominent speaker with us today, and before introducing the speaker, I would like to attend to a few administrative points. This seminar is being recorded and it will be posted online in due course. I will share with you in a few moments a link to our YouTube page where you can see our previous seminars, and it is the page where this seminar will be posted. I would like to ask you kindly to keep yourself muted throughout the seminar. When our presentation is over, I will invite you to speak if you have questions or to share your comments. If you have questions or comments, thoughts that you would like to share, please put them down very briefly in the chat function of this webinar. So when the speaker ends the presentation, I will invite you one by one to come in, to turn on your video, to introduce yourself, and to share your thoughts and questions. Okay, so let me introduce our today's speaker. It is Professor Dan Wagner, who is the UNESCO Chair in Learning and Literacy. Dan is Professor of Education at the University of Pennsylvania in the United States. Dan is founding director of the International Literacy Institute, which is co-established by UNESCO and the University of Pennsylvania. He's also founding director of the US National Center on Adult Literacy and PEN-GSE's International Educational Development Program. Dan has served as an advisor to UNESCO, UNICEF, World Bank, USAID, DFID, and other international organizations. Some of his recent books include a book published by Routledge in 2018 on learning as development, rethinking international education in a changing world. Another book published by UNESCO in 2018, Learning at the Bottom of the Pyramid, Science, Measurement and Policy in Low-Income Countries. And another book published even more recently in 2022 on learning, marginalization, and improving the quality of education in low-income countries. So you might have guessed the area of Dan's work is around marginalization, literacy, with a particular focus on low-income countries. And his talk today is titled Learning Equity, Some Limitations of SDG4 and the Potential of Marginalization Policies. The floor is yours, Dan.
Thank you very much, Maya, and thank you all for coming on. Even though I did not advertise this at Penn, I do see a few familiar faces. Somehow they figured out I was on today, and thank you from my Penn students for joining in. So I'm going to share my screen. And apologies to those who like a full presentation screen. It's simply that my screen is so large that I cannot see from one side to the other when I do a full screen presentation. So I hope you can adjust your screens on your own. And thank you very much, Maya, and thank you to Oxford and your program in Comparative International Education. It's an honor to be with you. It's a particular delight. I love Oxford, and therefore I love all of the students and faculty. And I wish I were there with you giving this in person, but we do the best we can. And since my time is limited, we're going to stop at the top of the hour. I've been given 25, 30 minutes. And so my topic today is on learning equity. I've been publishing in that area, as Maya said, and I'm going to try to focus today on the SDG4. Many of you are familiar with it. This is the UN Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which is on education and some of its limitations, or you might say obstacles, and where we might go with this. And I've been working in this area for quite some time and wondering how we ought to be approaching this. And since most of you are students, this is to you in a sense. How do you do your work? What should you be doing? What are the kind of challenges you have, and how can you make a difference in the world? And so I would be very glad if you put some questions in the chat, and we will address those in the second half of today's presentation. So I'm going to go fairly quickly over the first part of this, just lay the land. Many of you familiar with some of these ideas, such as what we call the global learning crisis. That is, in many ways, the basis of SDG number 4. These kinds of posters you have seen before in various ways. Different organizations have put them up. Many NGOs, nonprofits, non-governmental organizations are involved. The FCDO, the British government, formerly DFID, is making major investments in these same areas. And the concern is largely, and in particular, around the consequences or limitations, really, of primary schooling and eventually secondary and even tertiary schooling that all depend on kids who learn their basic skills while they are in school, or if they're not in school, how to get them into school. So these are the kinds of things that we get all the time in the mail. If you're on listservs, you'll have seen some of these or similar ones. You'll also have seen this slide, which is an image of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals that were announced in 2015. We're closing in on the last few years of that by 2030. There are also a lot of discussions taking place on what the next SDGs might look like, or even if they'll have that name. And number 4 is the one that I'll be talking about today, and that is, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education. So that's the focus. Now, how did we get there? One slide, in some ways, tells it all. This slide came out in the mid-2000s, 10 years before the SDG4 was declared. And it was, what should I say? It came as a surprise, at least, and a controversy as well, because under the old regimes, the ancien regime, you'd say, in the continent, we had the MDGs, and the idea was to get kids into school, and if we got kids into school, then all is well, and kids would learn, and we'd proceed from there. Well, it turned out that data started to be collected in the early 2000s, eventually a slide like this one, which showed that even kids who were in school from 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, even 5 or 6 years, could not read a single word. And assessments prove this in dozens of countries, not just, of course, a lot in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in other countries, South Asia in particular, and parts of Latin America, show that kids who'd been to school weren't learning their basic skills. And when I say that, I mean reading, writing, math, and other subjects as well that depend on those skills. So this was something that really turned in my opinion, was this particular slide, and many others like it have been repeated in now 100 different languages in almost 100 different countries. I mean, these kinds of assessments have been done. I would say the countries, there are only about 50, although that's a lot. It's 1/4 of the countries we have, show data that looks a lot like the data that you see on the screen right now. So how do we think about that? One way to think about it is to say, well, who are the vulnerable? Who are the excluded? And why are they there? And this is simply an indication of an approximation. Nobody has actually figured out exactly how many people are in the category and what ages. The World Bank has a term that they coined a few years ago called learning poverty. It's very similar to this kind of pyramid shape, where the industrialized countries are more or less at the top, and there are all kinds of assessments. I'll show you a slide later on about that. And then the low and middle income countries, where there are more people, but also a significant chunk, maybe 1 to 2 billion, that are in the bottom of the pyramid. Why are they there? Well, all kinds of reasons. Some just simply say poverty. That is true, but you can be more specific. Many of the cases we can identify poorly trained teachers, or maybe no teachers at all, maybe no schools at all. Also important, parents who've never gone to school, or they too were in this system before and never learned to read and write, therefore can't help their children. It's a very important factor in education more broadly. And also this term ethno-linguistic minorities, which refers to the overlap or the intersectionality between ethnicity and language, but often in groups of people. You could take the Quechua in South America, or in Peru, or you could take, let's say, the Hausa in Nigeria. These are minorities within larger populations that have multiple languages. And another way to look at this is globally, and we don't have a good global map of what I call learning equity or lack of equity in the world on learning, but this demographic density map is pretty similar, except that China on the right-hand side of the slide doesn't really fit as neatly, but the other countries in shades of orange and red pretty much describe where the world of learning is also weakest for the reasons I pointed out above. So I like to show that to give you a sense. It's pretty broad and wide. Not every country on this that is on demography is a perfect match with learning, but it's close. So what do we take from that? Here we are, we're in 2024. We're in the last 5 years of the SDGs. One success is that access to schooling has grown tremendously ever since there were UN goals. Now 90% of kids are in primary school, at least start in primary school. And secondary school, even in sub-Saharan Africa, is about 50%. Now that's kind of the good news until that slide showed up where we learned that even kids who are in school are not learning well. So bullet number 2 suggests that among the poor, at least, like along that density map I showed in the previous slide, dropout rates are typically double among the poor than they are in the middle and upper economic classes in low and middle income countries, especially the low income countries. And there's a growing gap in learning. It isn't as if that slide went away. Some kids, the economies have grown in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, and still the learning gaps are widening, we believe. There are some, we could talk about this, there is some evidence, I'm not trying to say that this is the truth for everywhere, and in your chat you might point out where there are some differences. That would be fine. One limitation, the first of the limitations that I'm referring to in the title of today's talk on SDG, is that the SDG is mainly what I call normative. That is, they are national averages across nations, with little attention to the varieties within countries and these different groups within countries. And that ends up being a very key characteristic of what I call the crisis within the learning crisis. And I'd like you to think about that, because you might challenge this notion. Why isn't it all just one big crisis? I would maintain that it is not. And it's really important to note the differences between different crises, different levels, different types of schooling, and different ethno-linguistic groups, and so on and so on. And that's the challenge for many of you on this call as students. I think most of you are probably students. The technical expertise in order to think about this crisis within the crisis is not small. So you really have to apply yourself, is my call to you in this conversation today. Now I'm going to turn to some data that were in the book that was referenced by Maya earlier on, which is on learning as development. And this is a slide taken from that book. You don't have to read the details of this slide. I just want you to look at first the title of it. Another limitation, or this limitation, is that we know less about learning than we think we know. You may think you know about your own learning and some other people's learning, but there's a lot we don't know as researchers. In the top right-hand corner, it's interesting to note, people have done this research, that 90% of the learning spending is on kids in school, where kids only are, on average, 3 hours of instructional time per day. Now, kids learn while they're awake all the time, but we almost only focus on kids in school, and even then, those kids are really only being instructed in an average day in a low-income country about 3 hours. And secondly, that the populations of research, if you go into the journals that are on learning, not just the Comparative Education Review or journals like Compare out of the UK, you'll find that 90% of the research on learning is from Western countries. This won't surprise you if you're in a comparative education type program that many of you are in, whether in Oxford or at Penn. But it says something about the bias of where our information comes from that in fact does leaks over into conversations around learning. So you may have to read part of my book to get that sense, but right now I'm just highlighting it for you. Another limitation, and some of you are very familiar with, for example, on the bottom right-hand corner, international tests such as PEARLS and PISA and TIMSS, often associated with the OECD. It turns out that if you look at these various kinds of tests, whether they are standardized regional, international assessments, or sometimes what we call the non-standardized regional tests, this group right here, which are the amount of the population which are high, middle, and low income. This is the low income group, the light blue. In each case, you find large percentages of low income people excluded from those assessments, whether they are local, regional, or international. International, almost nobody is included that are low income in the world. So what this says is that learning measurement is not focused on the poor, and it means that all of you who are students should try to work toward, if you're going to go to think about working internationally, this is something to really think about. Where do we get our information? Why is it that people who are at the bottom of the pyramid aren't included in these kinds of assessments? Another way to think about this is around my term ethno-linguistic minorities. And this is a standard UNESCO kind of slide, and it shows that the proportion of people who are in the bottom of the pyramid make up a very large percentage of people who are in minority groups or minority linguistic groups, what I call ethno-linguistic minority groups across the world. This is just a partial sample. And what's interesting about this is, since I'm writing a revision of my book, Learning as Development, on a second edition, I was looking, if you look at the bottom corner, it says UNESCO 2010. And actually the data were collected before. This is when they were published. And I thought, well, there must be an update. There is no update. You know, it's incredible how little we highlight these differences that I'm calling marginalization differences, and what I'm going to call by the end of this talk, marginalization policies. They largely don't exist. And this is really an incredible gap in, I think, our own knowledge base. So where does this take us? Show you some empirical findings. This is from a paper that was done some years ago by Crouch and Rolliston. You may know the names. They're pretty well known in the field of international education. And this was a study that used international data, the PISA math scores, and simply pointed out something that is kind of shocking when you see it. And that is the lowest performing countries have nearly all of their population is in the what would be called the bottom of the pyramid. The lowest performing countries look completely different than the middle and high performing countries on this proficiency level in math. Now, it may not surprise you if you've been reading up on international education, but it turns out that if you're trying to think about what you might do, this is a forward-looking slide. It's about closing the gap. And you might ask yourselves, this is the question we asked ourselves, and we asked Crouch and Rolliston, what would you do if you were OECD and you saw these data? OECD, Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. Many of you are familiar with that acronym and that organization based in Paris of mainly 60 or so industrialized countries. What would you do? Well, your idea might be, if we could just bring the lowest performing countries closer to how middle and high performing countries, I'm saying this simplistically, but if you were looking at it and you were looking at how to bring the world average in math up, this is where you'd want to work. And in fact, we've been working on this, and I'll get to that in a couple of more slides. So this was an eye-opener for us, a little bit like that slide where you saw so many kids who couldn't read even after going to primary school. So another way to look at this is from one of our British colleagues, Pauline Rose, some work some years ago, talking about another way to think about not just closing the gap, but raising the floor. If you look at the data for girls with parents who are illiterate, or in this case, had never attended school, you see the huge difference between the floor and where high parental education and a relatively wealthy family. If you're looking at data like this, you say to yourself, or we said to ourselves, this is an incredible opportunity to make a difference. But how can we make that difference? You can't necessarily make people rich. We don't know how to do that very well without a revolution. Aren't too many revolutions going on today. But you could work on, let's say, parental literacy. You could work on non-formal education for young women or young men, for that matter. So we know some things about raising the floor, but we still have a ways to go. So the claim here is the first solution is closing gaps. The second one is raising floor, which also closes gaps. So now I'm going back to one of the books also mentioned earlier in the introduction that I received, that talked about a book on learning at the bottom of the pyramid, which is now called an initiative, Learning Equity Initiative. It was called Learning at the Bottom of the Pyramid, which was a conference held about a dozen years ago here at the University of Pennsylvania, along with UNESCO, and became a partnership between Penn, UNESCO, and others. I'm mentioning them at the moment because we have increased this partnership with an NGO located in India called the Language and Learning Foundation. This foundation is actually a nonprofit organization that teaches more than 1 million teachers annually in India. They work directly with the government of India. They're very well known in India. And our role, when I say our, I mean the Learning Equity, LEI, initiative, is working on teacher professional development to try to promote learning equity practices in the classroom. And you might say, well, what are those? And this project is sort of off the ground, but we're going sort of into a mid-level effort to try to put equity more into the teacher training program of these 1 million or so teachers that get in-service teacher training every year. And one of the things that we think we've found is that these two areas right here are areas that have come up in our research in Uttar Pradesh, UP State, in northeastern India, is around how kids sit in the classroom and about the teacher's motivations and inability, self-expressed inability to stay focused on the poorest kids in the classroom. Now, this is maybe not news to people on this call if you've been in countries where either you yourself have been in that classroom or you've observed other classrooms. You may have noticed that often the poorest kids, the most struggling learners, are in the back of the classroom. I know this happened when I was in school in the US, when I was in primary school, at least I thought it did. And also the relative neglect of those kids in the classroom, even by teachers who were otherwise very motivated. And so one of our goals is to try to get these kinds of issues, that is how to change how teachers, where teachers put kids in the classroom and how they can a sense, remotivate teachers to pay more attention to the bottom of the pyramid, to kids who are being essentially neglected, and where the teachers are saying, look, I don't have time, or I don't have the energy, or the kids' parents don't lobby me to deal with their own children. These are not new ideas. But we are going into an equity-oriented teacher professional development training program coming up in a few months, and I'll be able to report back on how we do. These are actually a couple of the classrooms where either teacher training is taking place at the bottom or where we're observing a classroom at the top. So where does this take us? This learning equity initiative, where is it going? And by the way, we do have, I'll show you the website on the last slide coming up in a couple of minutes, but the goal here is to pay greater attention to the bottom of the pyramid, pay greater attention to learning equity, to try to reduce the learning gap, also to raise the learning floor. Within country, local solutions are going to be critical. To do that, we have to do research on those contexts. And I would maintain that outside of a few anthropologists, some of you may be anthropologically inclined or ethnographers, that's one place we could use more information. And to work across stakeholders, so research, policy, and practice for more systemic solutions. So we are not working alone. Our partnership with UNESCO is in part to try to see if we can influence the next set of SDGs to pay more attention to equity issues. So by way of conclusion, this isn't my last slide, but it is my conclusion is around this notion of marginalization policies. So what do we have? We could feel good that we've gotten 90% of kids into classrooms. But in fact, as I've been trying to say, children's learning is far below our expectations, and there are huge disparities, not only across countries, which is usually what the UN talks about. When I go to UN meetings, it's always, what do we do about the low-income countries, the LICs or LMICs? What we should be focused on, in my opinion, is the equity issues within countries. I have a little feedback on one of the lines there, Maya. Okay, and so point 3 is that we and others are trying to come together and say, let's keep our focus on the bottom of the pyramid, on Learning Equity Initiative. And if some of you are coming to the CIES meetings, which are the big comparative and international education meetings, usually held in North America, this year in March in Chicago, if you can make it over there. There are always sessions now on LEI or by LEI Network, which is about 100 faculty and scholars and think tank individuals who are working on issues around equity and learning. And I think our goal right now, and this is coming up a lot in our relationship with UNESCO, and feel free to write a chat if you're interested, is how do you get, this is really, I think, the toughest question of all, and one that's very difficult to address, is many of you are from different countries who are on this call. How do you get national authorities to pay attention to people on the margins? Some countries, I know in my own country, we think we are doing that. And we do have, since we have a relatively robust Department of Education, you can find work, significant work that's being done on kids who are marginalized. You might remember George W. Bush and the No Child Left Behind. It wasn't a big success, but at least it got the issue out there on the table. But beyond those kinds of words, if you look across the world, most governments do not have significant marginalization policies. They don't invest in it. And one reason is it's difficult. Another reason is ministers of education often don't last more than 2 or 3 years. In governments, the average is about 2 years across the world. It's a tough job. And relatively speaking, I think that national leaders believe that it's more costly to invest at the bottom of the pyramid than it is to invest in the middle where parents vote, and therefore you can stay in power, than to invest in the bottom where they tend to vote less. And one easy way to know that this is true, what I'm saying is not just guesswork, is to see where technology investments are made now in educational technology and remote learning, which are becoming incredibly popular. We can talk about that as well, but you can see where the investments are made. They're made generally in middle-class schools in the cities, not in rural schools and marginalized population, and almost nothing in local languages. So that gives you some evidence of where investments are and are not being made. And second to last slide are the 3 books that were mentioned. The second edition of the book on the left is coming out in 2025, I hope. And these other 2 books on the right side are available if you want to take a snapshot of it. You can get them by just Googling them, and they're free on the web. They're both open books. And the new book on the left will also be an open book if you want to wait around in 2025. Routledge, and Taylor Francis, based in Oxford, I might say, has decided to make it an open book. If you want a PDF of it for free, you've got to wait some months till it comes out. And let me end there to say thank you. Here's the website of the Learning Equity Initiative, learning-equity.org. And I think I'll stop there. I think I'm close to being on time, Maya. So
Excellent. Thank you so much. This was an excellent presentation and really thought-provoking, making us think about some of the key issues in our field. And I see already questions and comments coming in, which is great. I also have a few questions, so I'm now struggling. I'm facing a tension whether to start myself or allow participants to share some of their questions. So let me start with those who put their questions there, and if we have time, I will ask my own questions too. Perhaps I could start with Clinton Robinson. Clinton, if you want to come in, perhaps switch on your video if that's okay. Introduce yourself and share your question. We have quite a few, so let's be swift and to the point.
Hello, I've switched on my audio and video. I don't know whether you can see and hear me.
Yes, we see you.
Okay, good. Yeah, thank you, Dan. Good to be in touch virtually with you once again. Yeah, I was very interested in your presentation. Equity has always been a concern of mine. And I think my question is, about learning outside of school. The point is that school, particularly in a context of ethno-linguistic minorities, by the way, in some cases, ethno-linguistic minorities are actually the majority, at least collectively, if not individually. But school can alienate children from their local cultural context. You can take them out of that linguistically, culturally, and so on. And this, in a sense, stymies or stifles learning right from the start, that children are not enabled to be curious, to debate, to ask questions, because it's not in their language, it's not in their culture, and their own culture is not a subject or a concern or a focus of their education. They are being taught things that have almost no relation to their daily lives, to their parents' lives, to the local social, economic, environmental context. So I think your point, which you kind of hinted at, that there are some questions to be asked about how broader learning takes place for children, and by the way, for youth and adults as well, in the local context, but outside of school. I wonder if you have any comments about that and whether that is being pursued in research, and whether you have any ideas about how we could either bring that into the school or take learning perhaps more productively out into the community of such groups. Thank you. Oh, sorry, I'm Clinton Robinson. I'm an independent consultant in education and development, working for UNESCO, UNICEF, various other organizations around the world over the last 25 years. Thank you.
So Maya, I'd be glad to respond to this, or I can also
as well and address 2 together, maybe, because I expect more to come in. Would that be okay then, or do you want to respond to this first?
Well, maybe this one first, but then maybe others.
Okay, let's do
this one first, only because Clinton and I know each other well. We've worked together a lot, and he knows what my answer is, which is yes, yes, and yes, to his questions about ethno-linguistic minority, majority, and out-of-school kids. I didn't emphasize that in today's conversation, and that's more about a question of what do you do when you can't do, it's hard to do everything. And therefore, we made some choices, as Clinton would know and others might know. I came in pretty much through the same doorway as Clinton Robinson, who's very well known in this field as well. And I guess I made an academic choice. I'm saying this because we have so many students here. How do you make choices about where to put your time and energy and even resources? And so this was an area that the way we approached the Learning Equity Initiative was one that was had tremendous potential for us to work in schools with ministers of education and UNESCO. I completely agree that it doesn't cover everything, and I'm personally and professionally very interested in the issues Clinton raised. I haven't spent as much time on them right now because these other opportunities had come along, but I do recommend that people pay attention to the issues that he brought up. And I do in my book, by the way, but I just didn't in today's presentation.
Thank you so much. Mariette Bijanova, would you like to come and introduce yourself and share your thoughts or ask a question?
Good morning. I hope you can hear me. Yeah. So my name is Mariette, and I'm a student at PNGC. And yeah, I had the honor to take courses with Professor Wagner as well. So, and thank you so much, Professor Wagner, for such valuable knowledge you just provided. And I also had a chance to take education technology courses, and my throughout the talk, I was just curious about, since we are living now in a society, we have education technologies integrated in all areas of education. I was just curious about how ethically we can use education technologies just to make sure that it's not expanding this education learning equity that exists already. How ethically we can use this AI in digital tools, that we are really trying to narrow the gaps we have in education.
Thank you. Please, Dan.
Yeah, I think you can go ahead and maybe take a couple or three more if you want. I can remember this one. You're muted here.
Thank you to Mariette for this question, because actually one of my questions was exactly that, what could be the role of EdTech? So we will hear from you about that. Let's move on to Fahid. Do you want to come in, introduce yourself and share your questions, please?
Hello, thank you so much for the presentation. It was very eye-opening. So I have also a question on AI, but primarily looking at two things. One is, how can AI help us generate better data for specifically those that we historically don't measure? And the second question is, having been working in policy, specifically for this topic back in Lebanon, seen a real challenge between bridging the gap of policy research and implementation from a timeline perspective, because this is not how it, each policy has a specific timeline. Research needs a lot of time. So what's your also vision of how AI could help us bridge this gap of issues of project cycles and timelines that are not necessarily, they come together?
You forgot to introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. My name is Fahid. I am a CIE student at Oxford.
Great.
Let's go ahead with this too, Dan, perhaps, and then we can invite others.
Okay, well, one of my favorite topics, actually. I do teach a course, a graduate level seminar on EdTech and low-income countries at Penn. There aren't that many courses being taught on that topic. And so thank you for the questions. I do think that this is an area which has tremendous potential. And I think it fits almost perfectly with, and I used it as an example in my presentation. As you know, I mean, the issue of technology is coming up everywhere, and in many ways it's going in the wrong direction for the usual reasons. When something is very where there's a lot of resources, right now there are a lot of resources around the world, And where people can grab onto those resources, they usually go for the lowest hanging fruit. That is where you can install quickly, where there's electricity, where there is parents who care, and corporations are willing to put in money as well. Ministers want to stand in front of shiny objects and smile. I mean that with all due respect. It's a popular topic. It is also an area that fits well, I think, with my emphasis on marginalization policies as being the ones that we know that we could make a huge difference by putting technology in the hand in local languages with local content in ways that we did long ago with radio and television, but we have not done so in the digital world. It's coming on, but it's coming on more slowly than, let's say, the English and other language dominance that has been around now ever since the internet was available to us. So there's a lot to do. I've written a fair amount on this topic, both in my books, but also separately. So if you want to just Google me, you'll find half a dozen articles, fairly recent, on what we can do around ed tech. And we have some ideas in the Learning Equity Initiative on how to exactly try to address this issue. So if anybody wants more, and on Fahad's last question about AI, I think it's important both to think about AI in the terms broadly of ed tech, but also not exactly, because AI offers some unique opportunities, but also some unique barriers. And it's worth more conversation if we want to come back to it in other points. And if we have time, I'd love to share some of those thoughts. But I think in some ways it's almost too new to be able to speak adequately. I was just at the big conference that UNESCO held about a month ago called the Digital Learning Week, which was all on AI. And my own personal reflection is there weren't many people who were paying attention to the issues we're talking about today, neither on learning nor on equity. And to my mind, the intersection of those two words is really crucial. And there are very few people who work in technology who know how to put those two words together. And if some of you on this call, including Fahad, interested in that, welcome aboard. There's a lot of work to be done.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's proceed with our questions here. Jay Bradley, would you like to come in, introduce yourself, and share your question, please?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. Great talk. I was just wondering, thinking about the discussion here. It's just there seems to be an assumption that there are some countries that are on some correct path of development, and that the way for these other countries to succeed is to sort of copy this path, or to bring their students to the same place that these other students are. And when thinking in context of all the other SDG goals, right, of environmental issues and things like that, to put everyone on this same pathway seems to be maybe part of the problem here in terms of equity, right? Is this the correct path even to begin with? And does that need to be re-examined in light of all the other things that are taking place and all the other effects of learning and education development? Thank you.
Thank you. Great question.
Please, then, if you want to address, we have only one question left. So if people have other questions or thoughts, please give us an indication in the chat so that we know what is coming next.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jay. And Jay, where are you coming from? Are you at Oxford? You didn't quite introduce
Actually, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm actually at a U.S. University, George Mason. I found out through the CIES, and I was looking at this topic, and I thought, wow, I wanted to hear some more. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for that question. That's a question I should get more often. I don't get it as often as I should. It is obviously, well, maybe not obviously to some, but something I've thought about a great deal. And it gets at the heart of a broader set of questions. It isn't, it is in many ways the question of what do we mean by education itself? And it's true that I'm taking a narrower band of practices as my focus. I mean, it's still huge, right? What is learning? We could all learn to play chess when we're in primary school. That could be our content area. It's sort of been, it comes back to a little bit my response to Clinton Robinson earlier, is choices to make, levers to try to change toward a more equitable world. But Jay, I think you've asked a very important question. And indeed, I think as right now we are trying to move a very large chunk of what people call education in the modern world. I put that in quotes today, but I fully, and those of you who are in my class at Penn will know that we spend a lot of time talking about what do we mean by a curriculum, and whose curriculum and for whom, and should we prioritize reading, writing, and math, as I have done in my talk today. I do that advisedly. Only I do it advisedly because about somewhere between 70 and 80% of education budgets in the world are spent on those basic skills. Most of the money for most of the teachers is going to try to teach those skills. And in a sense, if you can make a difference there, then that would be huge for the world. It doesn't mean, however, and you're right, Jay, that it doesn't mean that everybody agrees on what those skills are or how to assess them or what to do about it. If you find that kids can't read, you could say, that's fine, they can go and do something else. And these questions we didn't invent. They've been around since people have studied education. But just to say that I think if I were to try to be practical in my response to your question, it would be back to this question of where do we invest our time and energy? We can, as if we're graduate students at George Mason or Penn or Oxford or anywhere else, we can allow ourselves the big thoughts, and we should. But at some point, it seems to me, and this is my own personal view, is that if we have opportunities, we've had the privilege of learning about the pros and cons of different kinds of pedagogies, different kinds of contexts, different kinds of organizations. We have the privilege to be able to think about those things and learn about those things. And then the challenge, I think, for any of us who on this call or other calls like this is, what do we do next? Where can we make a difference? It's one thing to say, well, I'm not sure if learning the way I've defined it here is what we should be doing. Okay, go to something else and see if you can find the buy-in, and that's legitimate. But I think at some level we also say, what's the world doing, and can we make a difference? So you take those ideas and see whether others will be convinced. When you know, one of my favorite examples when people ask this kind of question is I spent some time working in South Africa, rural South Africa, and we did a study of what parents wanted for their children. And this was in the context of learning local languages, back to Clinton Robinson's question. And this was in the northern Limpopo province, where there are multiple languages. And we asked parents, and it's being taught, the local language is being taught in school. And the question, one of our researchers was there and said, if you had a choice, what would you like your child, what's your child's future? What language would you like to be taught? And the answer was, as you might already guess, it was always English. And I'd like my child to be able to go to university in the UK. And these are poor, indigent families whose children, for the most part, will never even get into secondary school. So people's hopes and our academic ideas do not always, in fact, often do not intersect in similar ways. It's just to say that it's hard to know what people want and people need. That's a big question for people working in social science.
Thank you very much. You mentioned universities, and I thought perhaps it's a good point to come in with another question I had, which relates to the role of universities and tertiary education more broadly in addressing learning equity. Of course, SDG4 now contains all levels of education and covers the entire sector, and I wondered what your thoughts would be on the role of universities in addressing learning equity in low and middle income countries.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. We had a little chat before people got on, and I think that's so crucial. And one of my regrets that is that I haven't had more time to spend on that. However, my thinking has, some of the students in this on today's call are in a program that we designed at Penn to try to address this issue. That is, how can major universities, we happen to be at UPenn is one of the wealthier universities in the world, and we decided to turn that privilege of having that kind of wealth into a focus mainly on children in low-income countries, and especially children who are at risk of not succeeding in their education. My sense is, so going back to, if you would, since I thought you might ask this question, here's the answer that I might have given you earlier if we had had time, and that is that we have a huge opportunity, I think, as the Oxfords, the George Masons, the Penns, and other universities represented in this call. That opportunity is to say, again, let me do this in two parts. One is that as a wealthy university, relatively speaking, I think we have an ethical obligation to try to make a difference in the world beyond our own brands. A lot of the universities, this is a self-criticism, at least I'll say it on from my university. Fortunately, we have a lot of people who do care about these kinds of issues we're talking about today. But I'd say the majority are working on more focused areas of expertise across the board in many different areas, all of which we call in the US, a research university sort of definition, and where research can be almost anything you publish on. And it could have a reach mainly, and often does, mainly to a group of experts who are working in the same niche area that you are working in. Occasionally, you'll win a Nobel Prize when people recognize that area is important, and that's terrific. But seen from a social perspective, not just from an academic research perspective, we have some choices to make, and to work on the kinds of issues I've been talking about, and not exclusively to what I've been talking about by any means. I'm just saying today is just one of those kind of things that academics have an opportunity to work in, and doctoral students and graduate students in general. But I'd say another kind of opportunity, I wanted to get to this, is some of you are probably by virtue of being on this call and my recognition of some diversity in last names, maybe from countries outside of the UK and the United States. Maybe you're studying in the US and UK, or maybe elsewhere. But in many cases, this is some research I did some years ago. It was a group pulled together by Agence Française de Développement, which is like the FCDO or USAID for the Francophone countries. I put that in quotes because there's a lot of changing in languages in the Francophone countries these days. But what they found, they did research on people who received their doctorates in the last 10, 20 years, and they found that most of the students who studied in France worked on what we'd call the French style academic work in sociology, and most of them, only a small portion, actually worked on problems in their own countries. And I think this is the second part of my comment. So universities have an obligation, but I think universities also have an obligation to try to find ways for their graduates, even if they're coming from the US or from France or from the UK, are then employed and put to good purpose on projects that advance their own national priorities. And this is something that needs to be more talked about. I would like to see, maybe Maya, you and some colleagues could do this at CIES. If it's happening, I'd like to see it be more engaged in a way that people take it on board. And if there was a way to help on that, I'd be delighted.
Absolutely.
I've seen too little
Absolutely.
in that area. Would you like to comment?
Absolutely. And that actually connects with our ongoing project I was telling you about before we started this seminar, where we recently published a paper in which we show how international mobility can be linked with poverty reduction in low and middle income countries. We use largely quantitative data in that paper, but more qualitative insights will be coming up soon as well. So you focus largely on the on the ways in which universities abroad can support these countries, right? Which is obviously something very close to our hearts, and we are doing a lot in that regard. I think we have done a lot through our careers, and my current project actually shows that those transnational impacts can be very significant. I also wanted to add very quickly, before I move to the final two questions, that actually local universities themselves could be very important in tackling learning equity issues, simply through preparing teacher preparation programs and educational departments in local universities in Ghana or Tajikistan or Ethiopia. Local universities, even without international support, are playing a big role, and more policy focus on strengthening these universities, of course, would directly support learning equity crisis, in my view, because teachers come from universities.
Yeah.
Don't they?
Agreed.
Thank you. I will very quickly give an opportunity to two people to quickly share their questions. Very briefly, Anupam, go ahead, and then Tom. Then we'll respond and we will finish with that. Please, Anupam.
Thank you so much. First of all, excellent presentation, sir. Very insightful. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much, sir. An excellent presentation, very insightful. So my question is related to the basic terminologies in education sector, like ICH and PISA. So how can we maximize, or how can we ensure the implementation of programs like ICH or PISA at the different levels, either at school level or college level? And my another question is, are we doing enough to ensure education coverage at lower segments of the communities, like indigenous communities or low income communities? So thank you so much.
Thank you. And Tom, if you want to come in with your question.
Hi there. Thank you very much for, again, as everyone else has said, a wonderful talk. I'm Thomas. I'm doing my DPhil at Oxford, but I'm based in Zimbabwe, which is where I'm researching. And I was interested, you kind of briefly mentioned kind of South Africa and the views of South African parents about trying to make sure their children learn English from schooling. And we have a very similar situation in Zimbabwe. And I was typing out a question about this when you mentioned this in response to another question. I'm interested in your views on language and education policies. Zimbabwe has very much got quite a complicated language in education kind of past and history, of course. And more recently, there's been a big push towards, emphasizing the value of indigenous languages and mother tongue education. I think UNESCO has a similar stance. And yet teachers and particularly parents are often resistant to this, particularly given the past in which access to English has been restricted for the kind of Black Zimbabwean population. And then I wanted also to contrast that a little bit to, for example, Canada and Switzerland, which are, again, multilingual or bilingual societies in which parents often choose to send their kids to schools which instruct in a language that is different to the one they speak at home, because they recognize the value of learning in another language as a way of becoming bilingual or multilingual in as much as possible. So I think there's an interesting contrast there between those two ways in which we think about language and education policy. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Thank you.
Okay, let me start with the second one. I think I think I understand it pretty well, that question, and it's an area that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. I really appreciate the way, Tom, you brought it up. And I think what it shows us, I maybe use this as an example. Language in education is something that has been controversial ever since there's been education. Another one of these huge issues. And you find academics who've been on different sides of these issues and sometimes in between the issues of it, mother tongue, second language, third language. Many countries have different policies in that area, much more than I can do justice to, Tom, in any kind of response here. I still think it's an area that requires a greater sensitivity to local context. Ministers have a hard time making these kind of changes. They often lose their job over change in language policy. Rwanda recently is going through another kind of language change and bouncing back and forth. Morocco has similarly been every 10 years seems to change its language policy in one way or another at different levels sometime. So there's no easy answer, but I do think it is now getting more attention. I have very close colleagues who are working deeply in these areas. I've spent some time working in them as well. And I think what your comment, Tom, in a way is similar to the little anecdote I gave in South Africa, which is not little really or unimportant. It's just I didn't have time to really talk about it. And that is, there are a lot of diverse views. It isn't just an academic answer. If you can find a statistically significant difference in one kind of policy or another, it doesn't mean that people will buy that. And we who are on the academic side of the screen, most of us are probably in this call, need to be aware that some of the things we find in randomized controlled trials, RCTs or experimental studies, is not something that will get broad buy-in from other participants or stakeholders. So that's another kind of challenge that at least we've been struggling with. Again, I put it on the plate for all of you. And I'm sure that it's part of what you're doing in Zimbabwe. I'd be very interested to learn more. And by the way, I had my email on the slide, and you can track me down also if anybody wants to follow up on email. I'm not sure.
I can put the email again in the chat if people find that now. Yes.
Great. And Anupam, I'm not sure that I understood quite your question, and I know that we probably largely run out of time. I think it had to do with, I was looking at your comment in the chat, and I think what you were saying to me is, well, you had a number of different things you raised, but one of them is, which maybe I'll end with, is this comment you asked, how can we ensure that education coverage is with all segments or the lower segment of the community? And in many ways, that's a summary of my talk. My talk is about learning equity. It is about reaching the different segments. And obviously, there's choices to make, and people can work in tertiary education, lots of interesting and very important issues. You can work in reading, and then you have, or language and educational or sociolinguistics. This is truly a multidisciplinary effort and a multi-level effort. So if I talked about learning at the bottom of the pyramid and focus on early reading, it's only because there was an opportunity to really make a difference in this long-standing, very concerning area. But it needs support from all the other disciplines, academics, practitioners, UN agencies, ministries of education. There's a lot of work to be done. I'm delighted to have had an opportunity to share some of my thinking with you. Too short. I'm sorry if I was too brief on some of the very important questions raised, but I think we have to stop there because I was told we have to stop already 5 minutes ago. So
thank you so much, Dan. It was a pleasure hosting you, and it was a thought-provoking seminar. There were so many questions and comments, and thank you for all your responses. I also responded to Anupam with another resource that they might find relevant to their question, possibly. And I shared your email, so as you encouraged everyone to be in touch if they have further feedback or questions or whatever, that's very kind of you. So thank you very much. I would like to invite everyone here to join us in November for our next Global Public Seminar in Comparative International Education. Our speaker will be Professor Tatiana Fumasoli, who is Professor of Higher Education Studies at UCL in the UK, and she will talk about the role of Hong Kong universities in the emerging Greater Bay Area. Okay, thank you all for joining. Goodbye for now, and hope to see some of you in November. Bye-bye.